Dreams have been a source of great interest for probably forever. Just about every culture and throughout recorded history and what we know of prehistory, there seems to have been an idea that dreams convey some sort of meaning, that there's some sort of message hidden in dreams. And that message comes from somewhere, and in most cultures, it comes from some sort of other side, from the ancestors, from the gods, something like that. Not infrequently, very interestingly, the idea is that dreams reveal something of the future, that they foretell something. This is also a very widespread notion, as I say, across cultures and across different times. So hold all of that in mind as we plunge into the scientific study of dreams. It is to Sigmund Freud that we owe the first serious attempt to identify from a scientific point of view what dreaming is all about. And surprisingly, Freud concurred with the popular belief that dreams are meaningful, that dreams convey some sort of hidden message. But for Freud, that hidden message didn't come from the other side in the sense of from some mystical, metaphysical place, from the ancestors or from the gods, but rather from within yourself, the other side of yourself, as it were, from your unconscious, the part of your mind of which you are not normally aware. This was Freud's claim. Interestingly, when it comes to dreams foretelling the future, Freud's views again had more than an echo of popular belief, in that Freud came to the conclusion that dreams, not that they predict the future, but that they convey wishes. In other words, expectations or hopes about the future. That, in a nutshell, Freud believed that dreams convey from our innermost unconscious minds, they convey wishes, what we want. Things that we want that we don't normally know that we want. That was Freud's claim. This drawing that you're seeing on the screen, a drawing that Freud produced in his 1900 book, The Interpretation of Dreams. This was a sketch of the structure of the mind. Freud said in that book, if dreams work the way in which I think they do, then what inferences can we draw about the structure of the mind as a whole? And it's in this sense that Freud's dream theory became the foundation of his entire theory of how the mind works. Freud says that normally on the left-hand side of the screen here, normally perceptions enter the mind. They're then registered as we move toward the right in various categories of memory. These lines on the left are memory systems. And then Freud says, ultimately, they are encoded in these unconscious memory systems toward the right-hand side of the screen. Memories eventually are encoded in a non-declarative form, in an unconscious form, in a latent form, from where they influence our conscious actions. And on the right-hand side of this diagram, there's what Freud calls the pre-conscious system. In other words, what lies immediately behind our conscious actions. These are things that we can bring to mind, and this becomes the basis of our voluntary action. That's Freud's picture of the mind. Now, says Freud, when we go to sleep at night, it is this conscious side of the right-hand side of the drawing, that's what goes to sleep. Motor action becomes blocked, and we no longer have conscious or pre-conscious thoughts. And so these unconscious thoughts proceed in a backward direction. This is Freud's claim. They go backwards, back onto the perceptual systems, and therefore we have hallucinations. These are the dreams. That's Freud's claim about how dreams arise. He says normally our unconscious thoughts are filtered through our pre-conscious realistic mind and influence our conscious and voluntary actions. But since our realistic, reality-oriented planning and thinking logical part of the mind has gone to sleep, says Freud, these unconscious thoughts go backwards onto these perceptual systems where there's an attempt to fulfill them in an hallucinatory fashion. These are very big claims on the basis of, remember, a method that I just described to you, which is really quite shaky when it comes to science. The great Popper himself said so. Now, I told you I want to say a little bit more about this theory, so I'm now going to elaborate. Freud said that the pre-conscious system normally senses, it normally keeps from our awareness these repressed, heartfelt, embarrassing, childish wishes and urges. So we're not normally aware of these things because they're inhibited by the pre-conscious system. Freud said because the pre-conscious system goes to sleep at night, the unconscious wishes are released from inhibition. And he said that if it were not for dreams, by means of which they are deflected backwards, back onto the perceptual system, these wishes now are represented in the harmless form of an hallucination. If it were not for that, they would move toward action and wake us up because they're no longer inhibited by this system. So Freud says it's in order to not wake us up that we have dreams. We fulfill our wishes or attempt to fulfill our wishes in our dreams in order to protect sleep. We discharge these heartfelt drives in virtual reality, in hallucinatory form in our dreams, so that we do not have to enact them in the real outside world. Because remember, they're released from inhibition. They're no longer inhibited by the pre-conscious system which has gone to sleep. So the important point that I'm wanting to emphasize here is that Freud says that the dream, therefore, is a sleep protective measure. Dreams protect sleep, said Freud. So he actually made two theoretical claims. Well, he made three. The one is that dreams represent our most heartfelt hidden desires. Secondly, that they do so in order, in an hallucinatory form. That's the second claim, by means of this backward projection onto our perceptual systems. And thirdly, and most importantly, that all of this is for the purposes of protecting sleep. Those are the claims. There's in fact even a fourth claim, which is implicit in what I've said earlier, which is that the dream is not does not directly express the wish. You have to infer it. You have to reconstruct it from the thoughts of the patient. This is because, and this is the fourth part, this is because, says Freud, the dreams, if they were to directly represent your most heartfelt, infantile, embarrassing, repressed desires, then this too would be alarming and would wake you up. Therefore, they are disguised. Therefore, they are censored a little bit in a much more rough and ready way than our normal waking thoughts are. But nevertheless, there is a censorship in our dreams which disguises and distorts these hidden wishes. And it was that, I remind you, that Popper found so objectionable. Because there's no way, because this requires the analyst to interpret the dream, to find the hidden meaning. Popper correctly says this does not lead to falsifiable predictions. It came, I imagine, as a great relief when this thing that I've now got on the screen, when this objective method of studying what goes on during sleep became available. This method is called the electroencephalogram, the EEG. The EEG measures levels of brain arousal electronically. It measures, because the neurons communicate with each other by means of electrical discharges. It's possible to measure with the EEG what level of electrical activity there is going on within the brain. And that's what this axis measures, the level of brain arousal. This is a high level of brain arousal, and this is a lower and a lower and a lower level. On this axis here, we have time, 8 hours of time. Two physiologists applied this method. Their names were Azarinsky and Kleitman. They were in Chicago. They applied this method, EEG, to the study of sleep in the early 1950s. And they predicted, remember, Popper requires us to make falsifiable predictions. They predicted that as you fall asleep, so your brain waves will slow down. In other words, there will be a lower level of brain arousal as we fall asleep, as arousal as measured by the EEG. And that's exactly what was observed. Azarinsky and Kleitman observed that as we fall asleep, so our level of brain arousal decreases. The level of electrical activity in the brain descends down to this deep, slow wave sleep, it's called, a very slow brain waves. The surprise for Azarinsky and Kleitman, having confirmed that prediction, was what happens next. After 90 minutes, the brain waves speed up again. And then they slow down again. And then after 90 minutes, they speed up again. And so on in regular cycles throughout the night. So what they accidentally discovered was this paradoxical form of sleep, where although you are in repose and deeply asleep, nevertheless your brain boots up and reactivates in regular cycles every 90 minutes. They initially called this paradoxical sleep for the reason that it is paradoxical that the brain should be aroused during sleep. And they not unreasonably came to the idea that this paradoxical physiological arousal might be the equivalent of the paradoxical psychological events of sleep. The paradox here being that in the unconsciousness of sleep, you have conscious experiences. The unconsciousness of sleep is punctuated by intensely conscious mental activity, the mental activity that we call dreaming. So Azarinsky and Kleitman hypothesized that the physiological state of brain arousal that they discovered might be the equivalent of the psychological mental arousal that we call dreams. So they predicted, here's another experiment, they predicted that if you wake people up during this paradoxical arousal state during sleep, that you will get dream reports. And if you wake them up in the slow wave sleep, demarcated by red over here, then you will not get dream reports. Same applies here. Whoops, sorry, skip the slide. So they then set up an experiment together with a young man named William Dement, rather an unfortunate name for a mental scientist. And Dement confirmed this prediction. When he woke sleeping subjects up during paradoxical sleep, 90% of awakenings were accompanied by dream reports. And when he woke them up from slow wave sleep, only 10% or less of awakenings were accompanied by dream reports. So that's a very strong confirmation of the of the theory, a strong confirmation of the prediction arising from the theory that this aroused brain state that happens every 90 minutes during sleep is the physiological equivalent of the psychological state of dreaming. And from that moment onwards, I'm talking about 1955, from that moment onwards, dreaming and this physiological state were considered to be equivalents, to be the objective physiological state was a objective biological marker of the presence of the subjective psychological state of dreams. And that's very important, because now that we have an objective marker of when somebody is dreaming, we have the opportunity of investigating what the mechanisms are that lie behind those objective events, those brain events, those physiological events. And this was an enormous relief, as you can imagine, as I said earlier, for American psychiatry and mental science as a whole. We could move beyond this subjective saying whatever comes into your mind kind of thing and start doing proper science. Now, this state that used to be called paradoxical sleep that I've been talking about, the state of brain arousal, it was renamed REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, because one of the other features of what happens during REM sleep, during this phase of sleep, is not only that the brain waves become faster and more irregular, it's also that your eyes dart about, and this is very easy to see, rapid eye movements. And so this became the name for this type of sleep. REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and the slow wave type of sleep became known as non-REM sleep, NREM sleep. There are other things that happen during REM sleep. Very interestingly, your genitals become engorged, but let's not talk about that. The main way in which we measure REM sleep these days is we look at the brain waves, and we look at the eye movements, and we look at muscle tone. Because, interestingly, your muscles below the neck become completely flaccid, temporarily paralyzed, making it impossible for you to enact whatever it is that's going on inside of you during this phase of sleep. I told you that this was a great breakthrough because it made it possible for us to investigate objectively the mechanisms lying behind this physiological state that you can study using normal scientific methods. And what made this all the more viable was the fact that REM sleep does not occur only in human beings. It occurs in all mammals. And why that's important is because, unfortunately for those other mammals, it was considered ethical to poke about in their brains, snip away at bits of their brains, not to put too fine a point on it, to see which bit causes the REM sleep. Because the part that causes REM sleep is the part that causes dreaming. And so if we can identify objectively the brain basis of REM sleep, then we will have a less embarrassing handle on what it is that causes us to dream. A methodologically less embarrassing grip on it is what I mean. And so this is what we did. When I say we, I mean this is what neuroscientists did. Following Dement's great discovery in 1955, there was a race to discover which part of the brain, when removed, leads to a loss of REM sleep. And the scientist who led the charge was Michel Jouvet. And what he did in cat brains, what I'm showing you on the screen is a human brain, but it looks very similar to a cat brain. And what Jouvet did was he made progressively deeper slices into the brain to see at what level, how deep must he go in order to obliterate REM sleep. He eventually got this deep. He made a cut over here at the top of the brain stem, separating the whole of the forebrain, the big gray structure that fills out our craniums, our evolutionary pride and joy in us humans, the thing that sets us apart from all the other mammals. We've got so much cortex. What Groote showed was you can remove the cortex entirely from the brainstem, thereby disconnecting the brainstem from the organ of the mind, the part of the brain that represents memories and perceptions and cognitions of all kinds. You can remove this whole organ of the mind and retain only a brain stem, very primitive structure just above the spinal cord, and still REM sleep persists. In the unfortunate cats that he was doing this to, REM sleep persisted, carried on like clockwork with the same regularity, even when all they had was an active functioning brain stem. Groote found it was only once he got right down to the level of the pons, which I'm indicating with my pointer now. It was only once he got right down to this level that REM sleep stopped. That showed that REM sleep was generated at this level of the brain. That was in 1965 that Groote reported this. He then handed over the baton to his student, Alan Hobson, who was able to identify exactly which neurons in this part of the brainstem switch REM sleep on and off. He found that there were a group of neurons here in what's called the mesopontine tegmentum. These neurons release a neurotransmitter in the forebrain called acetylcholine. He showed that these cells fire rapidly as you enter REM sleep and activate the forebrain. In all the species that he studied, he focused mainly on rats, did Hobson. And simultaneously, there are two other groups of cells here. I won't bother you with the technical details, but there are two other groups of cells also in the pons, which stop firing as we enter REM sleep. So what Hobson showed was there's a simple switch. It's every 90 minutes in the human brain, these cholinergic cells here switch on, and these other cells down here switch off. So that's the mechanism of dreaming. A simple switch, on, off, click, clock. And this switch is in a level of the brain way below the organ of the mind. And what is more, it happens every 90 minutes, like clockwork. So Hobson concluded that the Freudian theory of dreams must be completely wrong. There's no wishes going on down here. There are no motivations going on down here. Acetylcholine is not a motivational hormone or neurotransmitter or neuromodulator. It is, as Hobson said, motivationally neutral. And it switches on and off like clockwork. And it activates the organ of the mind. It activates the cortex, thereby generating random images. The things that we experience in our dreams, said Hobson, are the forebrain making, and I'm quoting him, making the best of a bad job. It is just being activated. It's not meaningful activity. It's random arousal of the forebrain. And all that the cortex can do is join the dots. So it joins all the perceptual and memory and other cognitive mechanisms that are randomly activated and creates an episode, creates an experience out of it, which is what we dream. As I said, Hobson calls that making the best of a bad job. That's what the forebrain does. I predicted that if what the cortex is doing is joining the dots, the randomly activated dots, as it were, in the cortex, then damage to different parts of the cortex should have differential effects on the content of dreams. Damage to the visual cortex might result in non-visual dreams, I predicted. Damage to the somatosensory cortex, which leads to hemianesthesia and hemiplegia, paralysis of one side of the body, should have us moving in our dreams with only one half of our bodies. Damage to the language cortex should result in non-verbal dreams, and so on. All of these predictions, I want to tell you, were disconfirmed. None of that happens. It was a great surprise to me. The only one of my predictions which was in fact confirmed, I predicted that the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, which sets human beings apart from chimpanzees and other primates, we have very highly developed prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is in charge, as it were. It's the executive control center of the mind. Since we do not seem to be in charge of what happens in our dreams, I predicted that damage here would have no effect on dreams. I predicted that this part of the brain does not participate in dreaming, and that proves to be correct. Damage to this part of the brain has no effect on dreams. Blind raters, that is to say, people who do not know whether they're looking at the dreams of a patient with no frontal lobes or the dreams of you and me, they are unable to distinguish the dreams from each other. That was the one and only of my predictions that was confirmed in this study that I began in 1985 and ended 10 years later. It took me 10 years to do the study because I wasn't studying rats and cats. I was studying human beings because I needed dream reports. I needed to see how the content of dreams was altered by damage to different parts of the brain. So this slide here, the dark blue area, corresponds to the area of the brain that we're talking about, the prefrontal cortex. Damage here has no effect on dreams. But what I found, the other things I found were really equally interesting, if not a lot more so. And these other findings were surprises. The first surprise is indicated by this light blue area in the top left image on the screen. This is the mesopontine tegmentum. This is the part of the brain that is responsible for generating REM sleep, the part of the brain that Groote and even more precisely Hobson had identified as the dream generator. It's here, this area here. Now, what I found was that damage here, although it does lead to a loss of REM sleep in human beings, just as it does in rats and cats, it does not lead to a loss of dreaming. That these patients, I had 18 of them with damage in this part of the brain. By the way, I studied 361 patients. 18 of them had damage here, and they all reported ongoing dreams. And even if you wake these patients up during the middle of the night, you get no dream, you get no REM, but you do get dream reports. So this was a really shocking surprise, because the ABCs of behavioral neuroscience state that if a part of the brain is responsible for a particular mental function, then loss of that part of the brain should lead to a loss of that mental function. But what I found was it applies to REM sleep. You have a loss of REM sleep, but you do not have a loss of dreams. That means on the ABCs that I spoke of, that this part of the brain cannot be the part that's responsible for dreaming, that there is in fact a dissociation between REM sleep and dreams, that although REM sleep is lost with damage here in all species, we can determine in human beings that dreaming is not lost. This suggests that dreaming and REM sleep are not the same thing. This was even more strongly confirmed by virtue of the fact that I found that damage here in what's called the parieto-occipital junction, this area of the brain, that damage here to this part of the brain which is responsible for mental imagery, that damage here leads to a loss of dreaming, which is not surprising, because if you can't generate a mental image, how can you generate a dream? But these patients continue to have REM sleep. That's what we call a double dissociation of function. In other words, damage here leads to a loss of REM sleep with a preservation of dreaming, and damage here to these brown areas leads to a loss of dreaming, but preservation of REM sleep. So dreaming and REM sleep were doubly dissociable. Even more interesting, and this is the last of the several findings that I made, but I won't report them all, it was that damage in this area marked in red red means important. Damage to this part of the brain, which I'll show you on this slide, it's the white matter underneath the cortex here on both sides. Damage deep inside of the forebrain, underneath the cortex over here on both sides. This too leads to a loss of dreaming with preservation of REM sleep. So my main focus after that finding was, what is this part of the brain doing? This part marked in red, because clearly this is crucial for dreaming. Unlike the brown area where there's no surprise, if you can't generate mental imagery, you can't generate dreams. It wasn't clear at all why damage here should lead to a loss of dreaming. It wasn't clear what this part of the brain is doing that's so important for dreaming, because it is clearly doing something really important for dreaming, something essential for dreaming, because damage here leads to a loss of dreams. Freud, with those very basic method of free association, intuited that somewhere behind the scenes there's a massive motivational urge, a positive wishful desire activated in the middle of sleep. I mean, it's really quite remarkable that he was able to intuit this from the noisy psychological data that he used. But it really does seem that this is what's going on. Dreams are motivated mental states. The emotional brain is switched on intensely during dreaming sleep. It's disinhibited. The normal executive controls do not apply. And then we have an hallucinatory experience. It really does seem Freud was roughly on the right track. And when you come to a direct test of his theory that the whole purpose of dreaming is to protect sleep, bearing in mind that we've been in the embarrassing position in sleep science until this study of not knowing why we dream. We've never been able to ascertain a biological function for dreaming. And we dream a lot. We spend 20% of our sleeping hours dreaming, and we've never known why. So whatever else dreams are for, because I don't want to claim that this is the last word on the matter, but whatever else dreams are for, empirically in this little and ongoing study. I presented these findings when I first concluded the pilot study before I began the big study. I presented it to a group of colleagues about 1.5 years ago. And one of the colleagues in the audience had her little daughter with her, who was 5 years old. So her daughter listened to my lecture in the early evening. And then her mother, my colleague, asked the little girl, did you understand what the professor was talking about? Because she was concerned, that she'd subjected her poor little 5-year-old daughter to listening to a lecture not that different from the one that I've just given you. And the little girl said, yes, she did. So her mother asked her to explain what the talk was about. And I'll now show you the child's explanation so that you can get as simple a summary statement as it is possible to have of what I've just told you. This is what the little girl drew. On the 11th of June, 2020, which is when I gave the lecture, she made this drawing for her mother, and she wrote, "Why do we dream?" And she answered, "So we can have a good night's sleep," and then did this drawing. So that's a summary of what I've just said to you. Why do we dream? Well, whatever other reason it is, one that we've demonstrated empirically is that we dream in order to have a good night's sleep. Dreams protect sleep, whatever else they do.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can do so with the Weekend University Premium membership. This gets you access to our master library of over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, as well as transcripts, CPD certification, quizzes, and unlimited access to the recordings from our annual conferences. For more information, please go to theweekenduniversity.com/membership.